The courtroom was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. 1,000 breaths seemed trapped in the same cage, waiting for someone to unlock them. The man at the defendant's table sat upright, his hands folded carefully on the polished wood surface as though even a twitch of his fingers might betray desperation. His name was Elijah Cole, and his skin, dark as earth, was the loudest thing about him in that room. Across from him, a sea of white faces studied, measured, and dismissed. The jury, 12 strangers who already carried their verdicts in their eyes. The judge, robes draped like authority stitched into fabric, leaned forward slightly, as if the very act of peering down on Elijah was proof of his place in the order of things. Elijah's lawyer, a young white man with too much gel in his hair and not enough conviction in his voice, shuffled papers nervously. The opposing counsel, a seasoned litigator whose smile never touched his eyes, rested a hand casually against his briefcase, as though the outcome had been pre-written inside its leather walls. The bailiff called for order, though there had been none to disrupt, and the trial resumed. The opening statement from the plaintiff's side was supposed to be fire. It was supposed to cut through centuries of silence and lay bare what Elijah had endured. But what the jury got instead was a careful, trembling plea, words arranged to sound professional, sanitized, stripped of the pain that had dragged Elijah here. Elijah sat still, unmoving, but his mind burned. He remembered the night that brought him to this place, the night when a promotion was promised to him, only to be handed to a man with half his experience and double his skin privilege. He remembered the boardroom silence when he questioned why. He remembered the laughter outside his office door when they thought he wasn't listening. And he remembered the final insult, the file doctored to make him look incompetent, the whisper that followed him down every corridor until it wasn't just rumor but truth. And now here he was, stripped of the job he gave 20 years to, stripped of dignity, stripped of the benefit of the doubt. He had filed this suit not just for himself but because silence had become suffocating. Yet as his lawyer stumbled over words, Elijah realized that in this room, the silence still owned him. The defense rose with a smile. His voice cut clean, sharp, like a blade slicing through the thin veil of fairness. He didn't just argue the case, he argued Elijah's existence. He painted him as bitter, as reaching, as a man unwilling to accept that the world owed him nothing. He sprinkled words like competence, qualifications, performance issues, into the air, letting them cling like dust to every ear that would hear them. And the jury nodded, some subtly, some openly. Agreement before evidence. Judgment before truth. Elijah clenched his jaw. His lawyer whispered, "Don't react." He didn't. He knew too well how every eye was waiting for him to flinch, to raise his voice, to let even a second of anger confirm the story they already wanted to believe about him. So he sat, still, dignified. The first witness was called. A former colleague, a man Elijah had mentored years ago. The defense led him carefully, each question a stone paving the way to betrayal. Did you ever notice lapses in Mr. Cole's work ethic? Would you say he was difficult to collaborate with? Did he ever make you feel he was playing the race card to excuse underperformance? Each question dripped poison, and though the witness hesitated, though his voice cracked, though his eyes darted away from Elijah's steady gaze, the damage landed. The jury scribbled notes. The judge's lips pressed into the faintest of lines. The words, "yes," sometimes echoed louder than the silence Elijah's truth had lived in. When cross-examination came, Elijah's lawyer asked half-heartedly, "Did Mr. Cole ever help you with your work? Did he mentor you when others wouldn't?" The witness admitted, "Yes, he did." But the words came like afterthoughts, footnotes to a story already written in bold ink. Elijah's chest tightened. He wasn't just fighting for justice, he was fighting memory itself. The memory of who he was, of what he had given, was being rewritten before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Hours dragged into days. More witnesses. More rehearsed testimonies that chipped away at his character. A secretary who once laughed at his jokes now said he created a hostile environment. A manager who once praised his reports now claimed his work often fell short. Each betrayal was a blade, and the courtroom became a slow execution. But then came his turn. The bailiff swore him in, and Elijah rose, straightening his back though it ached under the weight of years. He placed his hand on the Bible, not because he thought the room cared about truth, but because he knew he still did. When his lawyer asked him to tell his story, Elijah's voice came steady, low, measured. He spoke of arriving at the company 2 decades ago, of staying late when no one else would, of fixing mistakes quietly so others could shine, of training men who would later be promoted over him. He spoke of the laughter, the jokes that danced too close to slurs, the meetings where his voice was drowned before it reached the table. He spoke of dignity eroded grain by grain, until all that remained was the choice to endure or resist. The jury watched. Some shifted uncomfortably, others stared blankly. But Elijah didn't speak for them. He spoke for himself, for the truth that had been smothered but not extinguished. The defense tried to corner him. "Isn't it true you once lost an important client account?" Elijah answered, "Yes, I did. And so did every senior manager in that department, including the man promoted above me. Isn't it true your attitude was sometimes combative?" Elijah paused. "I defended myself when my work was undermined. If that's combative, then yes." His words carried no anger, only a weary honesty that hung heavier than outrage. The judge adjusted his glasses, expression unreadable. The defense pressed harder, searching for cracks, but Elijah's dignity was armor. Not unbreakable, but unyielding. When he stepped down, silence followed him to his seat. Even the air seemed to hesitate. The trial pressed on, days blurring into one another. Closing arguments loomed. His lawyer muttered about strategy, about finding the right angle, but Elijah knew the angle had already been decided long before he stepped into this courthouse. Still, he sat each day, present, bearing the quiet storm of his own defense. And then came the day of closing arguments. The defense stood tall, confident. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, voice smooth, certain, "this case is not about race. This case is about a man who refuses to accept responsibility for his shortcomings. A man who wants to turn every failure into a conspiracy, every disappointment into a grievance. We live in a country of opportunity, not entitlement. And Mr. Cole, I'm afraid, has confused the two." The words landed like stones on dry ground, bouncing, breaking, embedding themselves into the soil of prejudice that needed little watering. The jury nodded. The judge listened. And Elijah sat, silent, his heart steady, because he knew storms had always raged louder than whispers of truth. His lawyer rose next, voice cracking at the edges. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you have heard here is not the story of entitlement. It is the story of a man who worked harder, gave more, endured longer, only to be told again and again he was less. It is the story of dignity stolen, opportunities withheld, character attacked not because of who he was but because of what he looked like. If you deny him justice today, you do not just deny him, you deny the very principles this courtroom stands for." Silence followed. Not applause, not agreement. Just silence. Elijah folded his hands tighter. He knew what silence meant. The judge gave final instructions to the jury, his voice carrying the weight of centuries disguised as impartiality. "You must decide based solely on the evidence presented, without prejudice or sympathy." The irony burned in the air. The jury filed out. The wait began. Minutes stretched into hours, each tick of the clock a reminder that justice was not just blind, it was deaf too. Elijah's lawyer paced. The defense attorney leaned back, confident, his smile thin but sharp. The judge disappeared into chambers. And Elijah sat still, breathing, steady, as though bracing for the verdict he already carried in his bones. The courtroom's benches had emptied slightly, friends and family stepping outside for air they couldn't find indoors. Only Elijah remained seated, his gaze fixed on the polished wood of the jury box as though he could see through it, through walls, into the hearts of those who now carried his fate. His lawyer whispered reassurances that didn't reach his ears. The hum of the lights seemed louder now, every flicker a taunt. When the jury finally returned, hours later, the room filled again, a congregation awaiting scripture. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." Feet shuffled, bodies straightened, and the judge reappeared, robes swaying with practiced solemnity. He adjusted his chair, cleared his throat, and looked down upon Elijah as if he were both man and measure. The jury foreman held an envelope. His hands shook slightly, though his expression remained stern, dutiful. Elijah's chest rose slowly, then fell, every breath controlled, disciplined, as though even oxygen had to be rationed in this space. The clerk asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have," the foreman replied, voice roughened by the weight of something he might never admit. Elijah's lawyer leaned toward him, whispering, "No matter what happens, you stood your ground." Elijah didn't respond. His eyes never left the foreman's hand, the envelope sealed with the truth everyone had already written for him. The judge nodded. "Please deliver the verdict." The foreman unfolded the paper. His voice cracked once, barely audible, before settling into steel. "In the case of Elijah Cole versus Harrington and Sons Incorporated, we, the jury, find in favor of the defendant." The words landed heavy, not like a shout but like the slow collapse of a building, crushing everything beneath. Silence swallowed the room, broken only by the scratch of pens, the shifting of feet, the quiet sighs of inevitability. Elijah sat motionless. Not because he hadn't expected it, but because expectation doesn't soften the weight of injustice. His hands remained folded, his face calm, but inside his chest something cold settled where warmth used to live. His lawyer muttered, "We can appeal. We'll file motions." His voice trailed off at the sight of Elijah's stillness. This wasn't surprise. This was confirmation. The defense attorney gathered his papers, shaking hands with colleagues, smiling thinly at the victory he had always assumed. "Justice has prevailed," he said to no one in particular, his voice carrying just enough for Elijah to hear. The judge thanked the jury for their service, his words rote, hollow, practiced through countless trials that ended the same way. He banged his gavel once, the sound sharp, final. Court is adjourned. People began to leave, their conversations rising in the aisles. Some glanced at Elijah with fleeting pity, others with indifference, a few with the satisfaction of order preserved. His lawyer touched his arm, murmuring, "I'm sorry." Elijah nodded once, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement that nothing else needed to be said. He rose slowly, his back straight, dignity stitched into his every movement. He did not slouch, did not drag his steps, did not let them see defeat etched into his body. He walked out of that courtroom like a man carrying the weight of centuries but refusing to let it bend him. Outside, the sky was overcast, heavy clouds pressing low, as though even the heavens had leaned in to witness what had just transpired. Elijah stepped onto the courthouse steps, inhaling the thick air, tasting freedom that felt like ash. Reporters gathered, microphones thrust forward, questions buzzing. "Mr. Cole, what's your response to the verdict? Do you feel justice was denied? Will you appeal?" Elijah paused, looked at the sea of faces, most curious, some hostile, a few genuinely concerned, and answered with words steady and low. "I came here for truth. Truth doesn't always live in verdicts." He turned and walked away, leaving their questions hanging, unanswered, like smoke without fire. Days passed, but the echo of that verdict followed him everywhere. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Old colleagues sent polite messages of sympathy that felt more like absolution for their silence than genuine concern. The company issued a statement about fairness and equal opportunity, words polished to disguise the rot beneath. Elijah found himself sitting alone in his apartment at night, the quiet pressing against his ears. The television flickered with stories of others like him, men and women swallowed by a system that spoke of justice but dealt in power. Each story felt like his own reflection, multiplied, mirrored, stretched across time. One evening, he received a letter. Not typed, not official. Handwritten. The words were shaky but deliberate. It was from one of the jurors. "Mr. Cole, I want you to know that I believed you. I wanted to rule in your favor. But the others, they said there wasn't enough. They said we couldn't go against the company without stronger proof. I am sorry. You deserved better." Elijah folded the letter carefully, placed it in his drawer, and sat in silence. It wasn't vindication. It wasn't victory. But it was truth, and truth, however small, was worth keeping. Weeks turned into months. The case faded from headlines, replaced by newer stories, fresher scandals. The world moved on. But Elijah carried the weight, not as a wound but as a scar, visible only to him, a reminder of battles fought without armor. And yet, life has a way of circling back. It was nearly a year later when Elijah found himself in a place he had never expected, the emergency wing of St. Augustine's Hospital. He had taken a job there after the trial, quiet work in administration, processing forms, ensuring the paperwork of the overlooked was not itself overlooked. It was work without prestige, without recognition, but it was work that mattered, and Elijah found in it a quiet kind of dignity. That night, as storms battered the city, ambulances screamed into the bay. Elijah moved through the chaos of clipped voices and hurried footsteps when he noticed a gurney being rushed down the hall. On it lay a man pale with pain, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with fear. And above him, clutching his hand, was a woman sobbing, "Please, please save him." Elijah's steps faltered. He knew that face. Even drained of its usual sternness, even covered in sweat, the lines of authority etched in his brow were unmistakable. It was Judge Whitmore, the man who had presided over his trial, the man whose gavel had sealed his fate. For a moment, Elijah stood frozen. The past and present collided in the fluorescent-lit hallway, the echoes of the courtroom ringing in his ears. He could still see Whitmore's eyes, distant, impartial, as he delivered the instructions that bound the jury's hands. He could still hear the gavel, sharp and final. Now those same eyes, once so cold, darted with panic, seeking mercy. And the man who had been powerless in his court was now in a position to decide whether to act, whether to step forward, whether to offer help. Elijah inhaled deeply, the storm outside rattling the windows, the storm inside him louder still. Nurses shouted orders. A doctor called for assistance. And in that charged moment, the question was no longer about verdicts or lawsuits. It was about humanity. Elijah stepped forward. Elijah's feet carried him before his mind could decide. He was at the nurse's station in seconds, his voice steady, calm, carrying the weight of someone who had lived through fire and still stood. "Blood type?" he asked the doctor rushing past. The man barely glanced up, barking, "Oh, negative. We're short. We need it now." Elijah's chest tightened. He knew his own blood type. "Oh, negative. Universal donor. Rare, valuable, life-saving." His eyes flicked toward the gurney, where Judge Whitmore's face glistened with sweat, pale against the white sheets. The man's wife clutched his hand, sobbing prayers to a God she only half believed would listen. Memories of the courtroom pulsed through Elijah's veins. The way Whitmore had stared at him, impassive, unmoved, as though Elijah's 20 years of labor, his sleepless nights, his silent endurance of cruelty, had all been irrelevant. The way his gavel had fallen, sharp and certain, as if justice had truly been served. Now the judge lay helpless, his robes traded for a hospital gown, his power stripped away by failing flesh. And Elijah stood there, blood rushing through his veins, knowing he held something the judge needed to survive. He turned to the doctor. "I'm O negative. Test me, use me." The doctor didn't hesitate. "Get him prepped." Nurses hurried Elijah toward a side room, their hands efficient, their movements urgent. A needle pierced his vein, blood flowing into the bag that would soon flow into the man who once sealed his defeat. Elijah lay still, staring at the ceiling tiles as each drop left his body. He thought of his father, who used to tell him that dignity wasn't about how the world treated you, but how you treated the world. He thought of his mother, who whispered scripture in his ear when life felt unbearable: "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." And yet, beneath those voices, a darker thought pressed in: what if he chose not to? What if he let the system taste its own medicine? What if the judge's fate became the same as his, decided by forces beyond his control, forces indifferent to his worth? The bag filled. The nurses carried it swiftly to the operating room, where Whitmore fought for breath. Elijah sat up slowly, the room tilting, his body lighter yet heavier all at once. His veins pulsed with emptiness, but his chest with something else, conflict sharper than any verdict. Hours passed. The storm outside raged on, thunder cracking against the windows like the echoes of gavels in 100 courtrooms. Elijah sat in the waiting area, his hands clasped, his body still. He didn't pray. He didn't curse. He simply waited, the silence around him louder than any storm. Finally, a doctor emerged. "He's stable. The transfusion saved his life. We'll monitor him closely, but he should recover." The wife collapsed into tears of relief, her hands clutching the air as though she could grasp salvation itself. "Thank God," she whispered, before turning and noticing Elijah. For a moment, her eyes scanned his face, confusion mixing with recognition. She had been at the trial, sitting behind her husband, watching as Elijah's dignity was slowly stripped away. Her lips parted, words faltering. You helped him?" Elijah nodded once. "Yes." Her voice broke. "Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because it was the right thing to do." The words landed heavy, not triumphant, not self-righteous, but simple, undeniable. She opened her mouth to reply, but nothing came. She turned away, burying her face in her hands. Elijah rose, his legs unsteady, and walked slowly down the corridor. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, each step echoing against the polished floor. He had saved the life of the man who had condemned him. He had done what justice could not. But he knew this story wasn't over. Days later, he was called into Whitmore's hospital room. The judge lay propped against pillows, tubes still attached, his face pale but recovering. When Elijah stepped inside, Whitmore's eyes opened, focusing slowly, recognition dawning like a shadow creeping across his face. "You," the judge whispered, his voice raspy, strained. Elijah stood at the foot of the bed, silent. "They told me, it was your blood," Whitmore said, each word fragile. "That you saved me." Elijah's expression didn't change. He neither confirmed nor denied. Whitmore's gaze dropped, shame flickering across his features. His hand trembled as he tried to lift it, then fell back against the sheet. "I sentenced you, without mercy. And you," he broke off, his voice catching. Silence stretched between them, heavy with all the words that could never be spoken in a courtroom. Elijah finally spoke, his voice low, steady. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because I won't let your judgment make me less than I am." The judge closed his eyes, tears pressing against the corners, though he blinked them away. He wanted to respond, but the weight of his robe, though absent, seemed to choke him. Elijah turned to leave. His hand touched the doorknob, but he paused, his voice carrying back into the room. "One day, Judge, you'll have to reckon with more than verdicts. You'll have to reckon with yourself." And he walked out. The story of the transfusion spread quietly. Hospital staff whispered, reporters caught wind, but Elijah refused interviews. He told no one his feelings, gave no speeches. He simply returned to work, carrying himself as he always had, steady, silent, unbroken. But inside Whitmore's hospital room, something had shifted. The judge who once sat in authority now lay humbled by the man he had dismissed. Every breath he took was a reminder that his life was tethered to the blood of the man he had condemned. And that truth gnawed at him more than any verdict ever could. The city outside continued as usual. The courthouse held new trials, new verdicts, new lives weighed and measured on scales that never balanced. The world spun on. But two men carried a story between them, a story no gavel could end, no verdict could erase. And though Elijah had walked away from that hospital, he knew this wasn't finished. The system had won in the courtroom, but something deeper had been planted that night, a reckoning, a fracture in the facade of power. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was louder than thunder. Elijah stared at his reflection in the dark window of his apartment that night, the city lights flickering behind him. His face looked the same, but something in his eyes had changed. He had saved the life of a man who once decided his fate. But what would come of that truth? What would happen when the judge left the hospital, returned to his bench, and faced another man like him? Would anything change? Or would the gavel fall the same way again? Elijah closed his eyes, the question pressing heavy in his chest, unanswered, unrelenting. And in that silence, the story waited, balanced on the edge of revelation. Elijah never returned to Whitmore's hospital room. He didn't need to. His part in that story was finished. But in the quiet halls of justice, whispers began to stir. Clerks noticed the judge's silences during trials, the way his gavel sometimes hovered a moment longer before falling. Lawyers remarked on the softness creeping into his tone, the hesitation in his rulings. He had been touched by something no law could codify, no statute could explain, mercy undeserved, dignity unshaken. Yet the system remained the system. Cases still rolled in, verdicts still fell, most predictable as the sunrise. Elijah still walked the streets as a man who had lost in court, even as he carried the knowledge that he had once held a man's life in his hands and chosen grace over vengeance. One evening, months later, Elijah walked past the courthouse steps where he had once stood condemned. The building loomed, unchanged, cold and towering against the night sky. But he was not the same man who had left those doors defeated. The city might never know the weight of his choice, the jury might never question their verdict, the law might never shift to balance, but Elijah carried a truth greater than all of it. He had saved the life of the very man who denied his own. And in that paradox lay the real verdict: the system could strip him of justice, but it could not strip him of humanity. For the first time in months, Elijah allowed himself a small smile. Not of triumph, not of forgiveness, but of quiet certainty. He had become proof of something the courtroom could never hold in evidence, proof that even in the face of injustice, dignity could prevail. And as the courthouse clock struck the hour, its chimes echoing through the city, the audience of his life was left with the one question the jury had never answered. If mercy can live in the heart of the condemned, why can't justice live in the hands of the powerful? The gavel had fallen, the case had ended. But the reckoning had only just begun.